Good morning, everyone. For those of you watching streaming, welcome to the Aspen Ideas Health Session on the FDA. I'm your moderator, Jackie Judd. If you eat, if you ever smoked, if you take a medication, then the Food and Drug Administration has touched your life. Certainly in ways of health and safety, but also in terms of your pocketbook. A remarkable $2.7 trillion that we consumers spend every year is spent on products regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Much of the nation's food supply, tobacco products, I'm missing the third one like Rick Perry did in the debate a few years ago.
Well, it's not just a third. There's medical products.
Tobacco, food,
don't forget cosmetics.
Products and cosmetics. I'm wearing some
radiation-emitting devices.
It goes on and on. It is an extraordinarily influential agency, and the man leading the way is Dr. Robert Califf. Thank you so much for joining us. This actually is Dr. Califf's second stint as the FDA commissioner. He served in that role in the final year of the Obama administration, and he was just confirmed in April to the job again this time. So you've only been at it a few months.
Well, it was February, right?
February. Man,
so
I need a redo.
The honeymoon.
That was a take one.
There really was no honeymoon phase. So.
For sure. I suspect when you go into the office some days, you feel like there is an avalanche of issues just cascading down on you. The Supreme Court decision this morning, for example. Before we get to some of those issues, I would like you to give us some insight into how you are approaching your job. What is your North Star?
Well, the North Star in this job is the well-being of the American public. It's the public health. So the FDA, you know, we think of it as a regulatory agency, which it is, but it's also deeply a public health and science-based agency. And so every decision that we make has to be guided by what's best for the public health. And of course, that occurs within a whole set of parameters that are complicated that I'm sure we'll talk about. But, you know, I always said I've had an amazing number of fun jobs, including one that I just left to take this one.
Yeah.
But the clarity of the mission of the FDA is something that's inspiring and keeps you going even when times are tough. It's the well-being of the American public.
Let's start in a place where I had not expected to this morning, to be honest. For those of you who have not heard, the Supreme Court ruled this morning 6-3, striking down Roe v. Wade. Before we get to the FDA's role in abortion medication, I want to ask you, as a physician and as a public health official, what is your reaction to the decision?
Well, you know, I'm not going to react to the decision. I'm not going to talk about the decision. What I will say is that the science and the medicine haven't changed. We have a big Supreme Court decision, and we have to digest that and look into it further before I'm going to react.
The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, put out a statement just a short while ago suggesting that the abortion medications FDA regulates and during the pandemic began to allow women to receive that medication through the mail after a telemedicine session. He suggested in that would continue unabated.
Well, the Attorney General and the President just spoke,
right.
And I'm not going to contradict anything that they said, but I'm not going to add anything to it either at this point.
I tried. All right, where I had intended to start was with the news the FDA made yesterday, ruling that e-cigarettes made by JUUL have to come off the market. This has been under review for several years. A principal concern has been the number of young people who have begun smoking these e-cigarettes. Ultimately, what was in the data that you saw that persuaded you there was no other remedy here but to pull it off the market?
Well, remember that the law instructs the FDA to weigh, first of all, it's clear there is no health benefit to any tobacco product, whether it's vaping or the tobacco leaf itself in various forms. So the question is really, the law instructs us to weigh the benefits of older people coming off of tobacco products using vaping as a method versus the harm done when teenagers become addicted. And I have to say, I'm a cardiologist, and I was practiced in a very busy practice in North Carolina for over 30 years. I feel like I've probably seen more people die or become disabled from tobacco than just about anybody in the world. And, when the JUUL decision, 2 million teenagers now addicted to nicotine. Knowing all that I did when I came into the FDA in 2015, I think so many of us think, well, we know about tobacco, we know about heart disease and cancer, so I don't really need to focus on this. But I had no deep knowledge of the extent to which nicotine is an addictive substance. It is really hard to quit once you're addicted to nicotine. It's not just a matter of willpower. I think it's every bit as strong as the opioid addiction. Now, nicotine doesn't doesn't kill you immediately like opioids can. It's really the tobacco that creates the cancer and heart disease, but the addiction is so hard to shake. So with that as a background, our science group, and remember the commissioner with tobacco, just like in medical products, the commissioner does not make this decision. I'm a political appointee. And the protection the FDA offers is the people that make the decision are full-time civil servants. They are not political appointees. They do not have financial conflict of interest. When they weighed it, this is publicly stated, the problem was the company's own data showed that there were substances leaked from the pods that, at least by the company's own data, had the potential for genotoxicity and other harm that just said we can't really see the balance being favorable.
Is that a problem specific to JUUL products, or should other manufacturers of e-cigarettes expect to be faced with something similar?
What I'd say is just like every medical product, each one is considered individually. The issues that came up with JUUL would be part of a routine comprehensive evaluation. When people ask, why don't you decide these things right away? Well, JUUL had over 100,000 pages of documents, and we had over 6 million vaping products to adjudicate. So you start thinking about the time it takes to get that right. And it's also been announced, the decision is being contested in court. So we have to assume that every single decision is going to be contested in court, which means you'd better get it right so that it doesn't get thrown out on a procedural matter.
How do you answer critics who say that if young smokers don't have access to e-cigarettes, they will turn to traditional cigarettes, which are even more dangerous?
Well, I think the debate about the role of vaping products, so-called ENDS products, in tobacco cessation is one where the science is not totally settled. But I will point out that we have allowed marketing now of 23 vaping products where the companies met all the requirements to say that in the view of our science group, again, not me as a commissioner, the view of the science group, the benefits to adults trying to stop smoking outweighed the risk of teenagers getting addicted for those specific products. So there are vaping products which are on the market and available to those who are over 21 that could be used for smoking cessation. I'll throw in one other thing which I really believe strongly. The individual companies are doing the research, just like happens with medical products. They do the research, they present the FDA the data. The bigger societal questions, I think we need a much stronger awareness of our big academic medical centers and our fellow federal agencies that for the big questions, we need research that answers the general question, what's the best way to stop smoking? And individual companies aren't going to do those studies. Just like, I'm a cardiologist, hypertension, the studies study each individual drug, but the strategy for how to reduce blood pressure is studied by the NIH. And so we need a much more robust public health evidence base now. We've come a long way, but for some of these residual questions, we need a much stronger evidence base.
Earlier in the week, the FDA let it be known that it was also going to move towards reducing the level of nicotine in traditional cigarettes. I think other administrations have looked at this and took a pass. And so I'm curious to understand how the agency decided this is the right time, this is a way in which we should use whatever political capital we have. And then finally, because things do take a long time within the FDA and many other government organizations, can this be done before the next presidential election when all bets are off?
Well, I mean, let's go back to two North Star issues. The number one issue for me is what's going to reduce the number of people who are dead or disabled because of use of tobacco products, given that it's not totally a matter of free will because they are addicted to nicotine, which doesn't enable you to easily exert your free will if your receptors in your brain are crying out, for nicotine. The second core issue for me is we've got to go back to the initial raids that David Kessler and colleagues did on the tobacco industry, where their own documents showed that they had purposely ratcheted up the level of nicotine in the tobacco leaf using what we would now call gene modification. But the old-fashioned way of gene modification is you just breed the plants and measure the nicotine and select the plants that have more nicotine. So the tobacco plant today is nothing like it was in the good old days. That's much higher levels of nicotine. It was done on purpose. Remember the phrases that were in their documents: create replacement customers, customers for life, those kinds of things. And so taking all that into account, I don't see anything wrong. We can't lower the nicotine level to 0. That's in the law. But we could take it to sub-addictive levels where if you really love the taste of a tobacco leaf or a vaping product and you're not addicted, then you might call that free will. But this would really, I think, the evidence is most people want to stop smoking, but they just can't. We've got 30 million people smoking. 500,000 people will die this year alone from tobacco-related illnesses in the United States. So how can we not try to do something about this?
And I completely understand your motivation for trying to do it, but I would love to hear a reality check from you about the prospects for this to actually happen. What I'd say is there's always a good chance. We're going to give it the good college try. Above everything else, I think the discussion, again, I'll say it. I'm an academician, worked in one of the best academic medical centers for decades. I don't think our major health systems and academic centers are doing what they need to do right now. This needs to be at the top of their awareness. This is a lot more people who are dying than are dying from COVID right now. And how much effort is going in our health system about this? But there's a lot of support. And remember, we're in the cancer version 2 with the president. He's very much behind the idea of doing something about cancer. If you want to reduce cancer mortality, this will do far more if we succeed than any specific chemotherapy than you can name. You've mentioned twice now the need for universities to step up and do more rigorous research. I hear frustration in what you're saying. What would it take to get universities to do what you would like them to do? Isn't it a lot of grant making from the federal government?
Well, grant making from the federal government will help, but let me be clear. It's not just universities, it's also major health systems like the ones represented here. There's tremendous residual capacity in the system, and it's not just research, it's also practice. What priority does smoking cessation clinics get? Remember that most people using tobacco products now are not in the elite university professor class. These are people who don't get as much support. Almost 100% of people with serious mental illness are currently using tobacco products. And so I think much like opioids, which I know we're going to talk about, we give it a lot of lip service, but in my humble opinion, keep in mind, I've made a living as an academic critic existing within academia for decades, but I'm really serious about this. If we don't pay attention to the leading causes of death and disability and the people who are affected by them, we're not doing our jobs. And we need to do our part. I'm not pushing the blame all there, but we all need to work together on this.
I want to move on now to the crisis of infant formula supplies on the store shelves that was triggered by the shutdown of a lab run by, or a factory run by Abbott Labs. I believe, I suspect you do too, that through crises, we uncover weaknesses, both in organizations, systems, and in individuals. What weaknesses did you discover within the FDA through this crisis?
Within the FDA, we had a number of weaknesses that we've talked about. We're doing a very thorough review now that will come out before too much longer. But the things that are pretty obvious that we've talked about already, the system of escalation of findings to the right people who needed to know didn't happen the way that it should have. The coordination between the inspection part of the FDA and the centers that have the knowledge of context needs work. And in the middle of the pandemic, we had some problems with documents getting to the right place at the right time. And you know, people have said, well, you're blaming it on documents. I'm not. I'm just saying this is in the list of things that we need to pay attention to.
You know, I still sit here and wonder, how could a world-class organization like the FDA have a problem as seemingly simple as the transfer of documents?
Well, we get hundreds of thousands of incoming things, and you know, it seems hard to believe that this one would have happened, but it did.
Right,
so I can't, you know, what can I say? We're going to have to fix the problem. So it is what it is. We have to deal with it and fix it. That's our job.
A couple more questions about this. Was a lack of supply chain information an impediment for the FDA to understand the critical situation that was almost staring them in the face?
Yeah, so you asked about problems within the FDA, so I wanted to not shirk the responsibility the FDA has. But this is part of a much bigger set of issues where there are major problems. You can almost think of this as concentric circles that get all the way out to all the areas that we regulate. But to start, I'll try to be brief here. This is a market that had 4 major suppliers, and 2 of them responsible for the vast majority. The 2 biggest plants making formula were built a long time ago. And so it was a setup for a mess if anything in the supply chain got interrupted. And we have argued for a long time, and I spent 9 months before I was nominated on the National Academy Supply Chain Committee, arguing that we don't want to interfere with successful supply chains, but if we have no insight into supply chains, when things go bad, we have no way of anticipating or fixing the problem. The industry has blocked us in almost every industry. Now, we've made progress with some, like in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, by law, finally, we have to be notified if there's an impending shortage. Okay. We had over 300 instances last year that we intervened in. In this case of infant formula, we had no insight into the supply chains, and it was hyper concentrated. Perhaps if we had had the insight, we would have averted this altogether by diversifying. And there was no backup plan. So, and you know, just to get one other thing off my chest, because some of these things seem unbelievable, but
yeah.
I just finished testifying that we were on course unless something totally unforeseen happened. And a flood occurred in the plant that was just
Right.
coming back
Right.
into production.
So you said this is all under review. At what point this year or next do you expect to be able to walk into the Oval Office and say to the president, the things that are within my control, I can assure you this will not happen again? With the caveat, the things that are in my control.
Well, let me, I just have to say this. I don't, as an intensive care unit doctor, I do not subscribe to will not ever happen again, because that engenders a thinking that, you know, sometimes things happen that you can't help. We went through this in intensive care medicine with never events, and that what that led to was people not telling the truth about what was happening in their intensive care unit. So I would say it's very unlikely. We're going to do everything we can, and here are all the things that we've done. And I think we're very close to that now, actually, very close.
In this calendar year,
Yes.
you think? Okay. Also under comprehensive review, it was a promise you made during some tough confirmation hearings this go-round about opioids and what you did in 2016. And in response to, I think it was Senator Joe Manchin, you promised a comprehensive review of the agency's policies regarding opioids. I guess I would ask the same questions I just did related to the infant formula situation. At what point do you think we're going to see something? And what's the what kinds of things are you looking at?
Well, let's divide it into two categories, and Senator Manchin wasn't the only one.
Right.
There's the past, and I don't think you're going to see any surprises in the past, but we will come out with a document that will sort of put together all the things that are known and that we could find in the history of how we got to where we are.
But I presume it will be more future-facing.
You're exactly right.
Okay.
But I'm sensitive to this because the senators seem to be focused on the past. I don't think you fix organizations by dwelling on the past, but I do want to be true to what I promised that we would do, and we're going to do it. But looking to the future, the thing that's abundantly clear, I think, much like I said about tobacco, this is not getting the attention that it needs from our healthcare systems. There's a lot of lip service being given, but what's abundantly clear is that there is no magic bullet and that we're headed for more trouble right now because while prescriptions of opioids are going down and getting more and more appropriate, we're not there yet. The big new thing is massive mail order high-dose fentanyl and methamphetamine that's manufactured in other countries and isn't going through you think of a drug dealer in a neighborhood. That's not the way it's happening. It's going directly in the mail. So teenagers are thinking they're getting OxyContin and dying on the first dose of fentanyl. That involves a lot cooperation with DEA because we're not fundamentally a law enforcement agency. But the thing that's clear about everything else, there is no magic bullet. And we have a list of over 20 things that we're going to do, or we're going to be told we can't do them for some good reason. So stay tuned, and we're going to start talking about that next month.
And let's move on to COVID. There will be pandemics in the future. There's worry these days about monkeypox, which I understand is very different. But what would you say are the one or two big lessons FDA has learned through the worst of the pandemic that it can use to all of our benefits when the next one comes along?
Well, I could give a long list. Two things that come to mind, one of which was talked about while we were outside waiting. We have to be proactive about misinformation and disinformation. And think of it this way. I mean, my career was made developing the new treatments for heart attack when it was just totally out of control. We've reduced the risk of death by over half. And these days, if someone has a heart attack and they don't get to a center that can open the occluded artery, we say that is a medical error. And there are entire national systems that even bypass the local hospital if it's not equipped to handle the case and get quickly to the place where care can be rendered. Here we have vaccines that reduce your risk of dying by 90%, and antivirals that if you're in the unlucky 10% that might have died, take another 90% out of it. So almost no one should be dying from COVID now if people got the right information. This is a major struggle.
Well,
I know we might talk about that more.
It was actually going to be where I was next going to turn, and to my mind, you have said one of the most provocative statements of any public health official I can remember in the last several years, and the statement is that disinformation is now the leading cause of death in America. That's a powerful, provocative statement. And I want to understand where that's coming from. You just described it to a degree, and how you quantify it. You're a man of science, so quantify it.
Yeah, so a more precise statement, I think, might be the leading cause of meaningful life years lost. Because still one of my favorite quotes in medicine is that life is a sexually transmitted disease with 100% mortality. So we're all going to die. We're all going to die of something. And so, but the question is, are we dying sooner than we should have for reasons that were preventable? And so let's look at what people are dying, and let's also keep in mind the U.S. is unique right now among high-income countries. We now pass the 5-year mark. We live 5 years shorter than the average of high-income countries. We're headed the wrong direction, and it's not for some mysterious disease. There's COVID, which I've already talked about. We should have a much lower COVID mortality with treatments that are free and readily available, and people aren't getting them. And disinformation, as you know, means purposeful misinformation intended to harm people. But misinformation also has an effect, even if it's not purposeful. If you're telling people to take treatments that are ineffective and they don't take the ones that are, that's dangerous. So then let's look at everything else. What's causing death? Number one is heart disease, preventable by diet, exercise, and we have a slew of generic medicines that are highly effective that many people are not getting the way they should. Cancer, number two. Without tobacco products, our rate of cancer would be cut dramatically as a premature cause of death. Stroke, number three. And then we go down the list, it's obesity and diabetes. These are things that are treatable and preventable, and in the slew of all of this other information, the stuff that really works is not getting applied the way that it should. The way I think about it, and the thing I love about the FDA, it's so much fun to think about the great new technologies and all. There will be some that will make a huge difference. Like now we have drugs for obesity that appear to reduce your risk of death and heart failure and stroke while you're losing weight. It came from I see Dr. Scholar, it came from the diabetes community. These drugs were not developed for heart disease, but they work for that. That's great, but it's almost like we invent things and the rest of the world figures out how to use them better.
So because of the times we're living in, I guess I associate the campaign of disinformation most closely to what you cited, the vaccines and the unneeded deaths during COVID. But how do you connect that phenomenon to deaths from cancer or heart disease or stroke?
Well,
the
so
phenomenon
this
of
is
disinformation.
The disinformation part, I'll just pick on statins for a minute. I'm a cardiologist. Statins are generic. They dramatically reduce your risk, particularly if you've already had a cardiac event, dramatically reduce your risk of death and heart attack and stroke and just about everything else. But there's been a plethora of, bad information. And there's even really good studies when the press revs up on a misinformation article in countries in Scandinavia where they have good measurements, people stop taking their medicines and the rate of stroke and death goes up. So that's one really good example. But in the area of cancer, as I say, if you tell me advertising has had nothing to do with tobacco, or that vaping was not
Fair
driven
enough.
by purposeful advertising to teenagers about how cool it is, I don't know, we have to have another discussion.
So are there people within the FDA who are trying to research ways in which true factual information can emerge and trump the disinformation?
I'd say there's a global emerging network of scholars and people, and we know so much about it now. But I would also
don't know what to do about it.
That's where I was going. I have not heard anyone that has a solution to the problem that's likely to work. And I've talked with just about all the experts. One nice thing about FDA commissioner in general, if you call somebody, they return the call or will come to see you. So we've got to keep working on the strategy. There are people at FDA working on it, but it's got to be all of government. But also, 100% of experts agree government cannot solve this. We have too much mistrust in our fundamental institutions in this country. Can I pick on my academic medical center colleagues again? I mean, universities are here to find the truth and promote it. How much effort is going into, at the fundamental grassroots level of the people we interact with, combating misinformation? I would say not nearly enough.
Well, you just touched on something that I wanted to bring into this conversation. I kind of view disinformation and trust almost as a double helix. They're intertwined. And if someone doesn't trust you as the FDA commissioner, they are going to be quite willing to listen to information that happens not to be factual. So in the way I asked, are folks at the FDA working on combating disinformation? Are you talking about how do we rebuild trust where trust has been broken? And it's not across the board at the FDA, certainly.
Well, so fundamentally, at least my belief is you build trust by telling the truth and doing what you say you're going to do. And that's an effort we have to make in the face of a lot of criticism on all sides that could, I want to say a word about that in a second. But so it's you know, the way to build trust is to be trustworthy.
Yes.
You know, 30 years ago, and I've actually saved the slides. I won't show them to anyone, but I was in a session with pharma executives, and there was a consultant there who spoke before me who had just finished with the tobacco industry and the oil industry. And the slide I'll never forget, he said, you say that you're concerned that people don't trust you. The reason is because you're not acting trustworthy. And then he went through the reasons that's the case. So we have to act trustworthy to be trusted. But there is a phenomenon going on that I'm very worried about right now that has to do with my friends. You know that the FDA has to make decisions even when there's not societal agreement about the right decision, down to the, and we have to make it. We're like referees in a sport where we have to make the call, and we don't necessarily have the advantage of the replay to go back and look at it and study it and change our decision in real time. And that means any decision we make, almost everybody's going to disagree with some part of it. And because of the hyper-advanced Twitterati world that we now live in, our best friends are undermining confidence in our societal institutions.
Who are your best friends?
I'd say people who generally believe there should be regulated industries and decisions made that are in the interest of the public health. If they disagree with 5% of what we've done, that's the first thing that appears out in is the areas of disagreement, not the areas of agreement. And I'm increasingly worried about that because I don't think it's intentional to create mistrust. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be criticized. That's one of the most valuable parts of being in the United States is, you know, public officials and public decisions are open for criticism. But if you were just a normal person out there listening to all that goes on, it would be hard to have confidence, even from people who do fundamentally believe in the institutions. I hope that makes sense the way I'm saying it.
I spent a lot of my career in television, and it's the danger of the 15-second soundbite, and you pick out the soundbite that is sexiest and kind of provides the most grist for the story. Just before you and I got up here, there was another panel with the CDC director, and she spoke about this yesterday as well, that what keeps her up at night is disinformation. And it's what you've shared with us as well. And she also spoke yesterday about how, as a public official, to respond to people who doubt what you're saying when it is an established fact. And stating a fact now suddenly has become a political act, right? How do you personally respond to that when nefarious reasons are attached to something that you're saying as a scientist that's been proven?
Well, I long for the days of being in medical meetings as a doctor where what I would have said is, you're wrong and what you're saying is killing people, okay? I can't, I won't mention any specific incidents now where I might have wished I could say that, but what I will say is the way out of this is we have to build a network of like-minded people who are committed to the truth and willing to put themselves on the line to support the truth in the face. And, we haven't even talked about the worst form of disinformation, which is state-sponsored disinformation intended. I don't know whether to be proud of this, but about a decade ago, I said, if you are wanting to take down the United States and kill Americans without declaring a war, the best way to do it will be to promote disinformation about fundamental things in health that save lives. And I don't know how much is coming from various sources, but we need like-minded people to band together and agree on where there's truth. And the best way to combat it out there in the real world is for a person that you trust to have that conversation. It's not by me saying more things on the internet. That's not going to change it. We need at every level, the community practitioner, nurses, pharmacists, community colleges, people who are engaged in human conversations with people about the truth, because they're dying,
Right.
as I was saying, unnecessarily.
Well, I'm glad we had a chance to focus on it, because personally I think it's one of the issues of our times. And I want to ask you one last question before I open it up to all of you. I hope you have some questions in mind. 6 years ago, probably to the day, down on the other side of campus, I was on stage interviewing 6 former FDA commissioners, Democrats and Republicans. You were in the audience. You had just been confirmed, I think. And I asked them all a question, and it was a unanimous vote, yes. Do you believe that the FDA should become an independent agency? So 6 years later, I ask you that question.
Well, I'm going to evade the question specifically, but I will, what I will say.
I thought it'd be fun to ask.
Anyone who believes that it's good for such a critical federal agency to have 5 different commissioners in 6 years, I would just say that is insane. And the more that can be done to remove FDA commissioner role from being a political role to being something of a trusted individual who's off cycle would be much better. Because if you were 2 or 3 levels down in the agency, you would just say, these people are going to come and go. And yet we know that the biggest thing the FDA needs to do now internally, we've got all these centers. They used to live relatively separately, but the science actually is converging. The science of food safety, pathogens, genomics, and the science of drugs and biologics is really converging. And the information systems that are needed, we didn't talk about federal information systems, but I know in the CDC discussions, the need for better data, just absolutely critical. So you need some stability in the organization in order to create what the public needs.
Well, I hear you moving in that direction.
Leaning
in that direction,
I'll
I'll say.
That's a fair statement. I mean,
okay.
And I will say, during this administration, which is the only one I've experienced, there is a healthy respect for the idea that the FDA is different than the other HHS agencies, because we are making regulatory decisions. That's different than a pure public health decision, because we have laws that govern how we make those, and the decisions as I keep saying, are not made by the commissioner. They're made by individuals who do not have a conflict of interest and are operating under that set of laws. Much like you can criticize the referees in a basketball game, I do that all the time, but they're operating from a rule book. And you don't ask the team owners to make the judgment about what the call should be.
Okay, your turn to ask him questions. There are two women with microphones right up here. And if you would stand and identify yourself, that would be terrific.
Hi, I'm Jakub Hlavka, University of Southern California. I'm a researcher. I'm curious about advertising. I know there's prescription drugs, and the US is one of the few countries in the world that allows advertising. And also there's dietary supplements that are quite unregulated, and there's a lot of statements made. So I'm just curious about where you stand on those, and where do you see, say, the next 12, 24 months taking us on those fronts?
I don't see much happening with either of those issues in the next 12 or 24 months because regardless of my personal views about advertising for medical products, it's the law of the land supported by the courts that advertising is allowed in the United States. And, you know, the courts I think are pretty, I don't see a big change happening in the courts in the next short period of time. For supplements, I do have hope that at least we may have regulation that says you have to say what's in your supplement. That's at least a start.
Yeah.
And I'll point you to a systematic overview that just appeared in JAMA from the U.S. Public Service Task Force about the risks and benefits of supplements. I would just advise that people read when they think about spending their money on particular supplements.
Did I see somebody's hand go up over here? Just wait for the mic for a moment, please. And then next one is this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Amber Butterfield. I'm from the TRICARE Health Plan, and I'd like to know if the FDA is going to continue to regulate or approve lab-developed tests.
That's a hot item. As you know, right now, we have the power to regulate, but we're using enforcement discretion, which means the field is flourishing without super regulation. My fundamental belief, and I'm a 30-plus year academic, is that patients should not be concerned about who's making the test. They should be concerned about whether the test is yielding the information that it's purported to yield. And I'm in favor of having that be something that you have to prove rather than something where you can say, I don't have to prove it because I'm from some particular place that's making a test. Within that, we do, I think, I do strongly believe that we have to protect the role of, for example, people with rare diseases where there's an expert who's working in a lab and fiddling with tests. There has to be some freedom to do that in particular circumstances, which I deeply believe in, having worked in academia for a long time. So as you know, that's something that's in the discussion phase right now in the current legislation.
Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is James Corbett. I'm an ethicist, and I want to start by saying thank you for your service, second time around, and thank you for your service at Verily, where I last saw you, that state-of-the-art recovery campus in Dayton, Ohio. My question is really this question of leadership. So I want to talk about the conflict of obligation. So not a conflict of interest, that's a legal term, but a conflict of obligation, the obligation you have to your corporate role and the obligation you have to your God as a father, as a husband. So how do you battle that every day? I think there's lessons in what you're dealing with in leadership in turbulent times. So I'm not trying to make news, just trying to have an understanding of your personal challenge of conflicts of obligation.
I think this is really a fundamental issue, and you may remember the days about 15 years ago when it became popular transiently in business schools to talk about the fact that corporate boards needed an ethicist on the board. That actually happened for about a year, and then it just suddenly disappeared. And so I think we need to re-enter the discussion because it is a balance. People say, well, companies just are there to make money. I would refer you to a podcast with General Pernas, who did the supply chain and warp speed with Andy Slavitt. It talks about how that's gotten us into trouble, and we've got to rebalance this obligation. I am looking at, we have some ethicists at FDA. I'm actually looking at hiring Stay tuned. I'm looking at hiring some ethicists. Because I mean, the other thing I'll just say, my FDA colleagues are probably don't want me to say this, but government, when in government you say ethics, you're almost strictly talking about the financial conflict.
Yeah.
That's not ethics. It's one component of ethics. There are other very profound components of ethics that we need to pay a lot more attention to.
What would be your number one?
It is this balance of obligations that you have about public health, science, and law. When do you draw the line about, you're in an environment where a lot of decisions are going to happen that you may or may not agree with that affect you. Just when we're talking about government. And then there's some other really core issues about information. Right now, I believe that a number of Americans are suffering because we don't share information in America enough. The CDC...
Well, don't share enough good, solid information.
But health data is a good example. And, don't get me wrong, people that misuse health data need to be punished severely. But if you had a heart attack today, you should thank God that we combined all the data and we know the right treatment.
I thank God I'm on stage with a cardiologist. Over here.
Hey, Dr. Califf, Dave Callion. Haven't seen you since Duke, so pretty excited to see you again. I work a lot in the military and veteran health system and think about the innovation ecosystem that we're starting to create there. I see a huge gap in the evidence that we generate once a drug or an intervention is available to market, to actually understand, for example, psychedelics and the context that you need to be giving them in to make them work, if they're going to work at all. And then how your role in the FDA to be able to kind of put some guardrails around how we use these things as they enter market. I'd love to hear how you think about clinical effectiveness and post-market surveillance and all the other elements that we really kind of have gaps around today.
Almost every question you all have asked, I wish we had an hour to discuss it, but because let's make two categories of things. There are products where the FDA allows marketing based on evidence that the risks outweigh the benefits for the intended use. And then there are products that are out there being used in large scale by Americans that are in Never Never Land. We jokingly used to talk about an area of vices and bad decisions. It's cannabis products, psychedelics are somewhere in between, kratom. And what I'll say about this category is the regulatory schema we have right now is not working. And I'm not saying anything revolutionary. The briefings that I got in 2016 and the briefings that I got in 2022 look almost exactly the same. And no one's happy with that. So stay tuned. I think we're going to have some interesting things to say about how to think differently about the regulatory schema for those sorts of things. But this other one is a really big one. If you do a narrow study that says drug A is great for people with this disease under these circumstances, then we put it out there on the market. What happens after that? We don't have a system in America for getting the right answers to those questions. Now, that's not strictly within FDA's lane, but the analogy I've used that Congress seemed to gravitate to is it's like a relay race. FDA runs its lap. Are we going to have a smooth handoff to the baton to CMS and other payers where we run side by side, or are we just going to drop the baton in the dark and then they've got to pick it up and figure out what to do with it? Yeah. So I know Chiquita was here yesterday. We are having discussions with CMS, and I don't think the fundamental mission of FDA should change, and we are not concerned about cost as a primary issue. But we need to have a smoother system so that when you do go to your doctor or your nurse practitioner, what's prescribed for your problem actually has evidence to say it's the right thing. I feel very confident about this statement because I've said this for 30 years now.
Okay.
I still run into people, some very influential, who say that your doctor knows best. Doctors are not magical. They don't know which treatment is better unless someone's done a study that has the right methods that shows that it actually is better. And we have got to develop a better evidence generation system. It's one of the reasons that I agreed to come back.
All right. So at this event 6 years ago, I asked all the FDA commissioners what advice would they give Dr. Califf, and a couple of them said, be bold, stick to your principles. The evidence to date seems that you are doing that. We all wish you well, and we thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.